In the chandelier-lit ballroom of the Peninsula Hotel, golden light sparkled over crystal glasses and silk gowns as billionaire Walter Grayson leaned over his lavish birthday cake, his friends and business partners singing with forced smiles. The scent of expensive cologne mixed with the aroma of seared steaks and truffle oil swirling in a room where secrets hid behind polished veneers. Outside, the Chicago winds howled like restless ghosts, pressing cold fingers against the glass, as if trying to sneak inside and whisper forgotten truths. Walter's steel-gray eyes held a flicker of exhaustion, though he wore the grin of a man who owned half the city and pretended to care about the other half. Cameras flashed as guests raised flutes of Dom Perignon, eager to capture the moment for social media feeds and glossy magazines. Somewhere near the grand piano, a string quartet played a soft rendition of Fly Me to the Moon, almost drowned out by laughter. Behind the laughter, though, was tension, for Walter was rumored to be hiding secrets big enough to shatter empires. His assistant hovered nearby, clutching a phone, her eyes darting nervously toward him every few seconds. Meanwhile, a soft, barely perceptible scratching sound rose from beneath a draped dessert table. And at that exact second, no one could have guessed that everything was about to fall apart because of a pair of green feline eyes. You won't believe how this story unfolds. It will pierce even the hardest hearts and leave you questioning how a simple creature could unravel a truth powerful enough to destroy a billionaire's world. Earlier that afternoon, Walter had stared at his reflection in the penthouse mirror, struggling to find himself beneath tailored suits and diamond cufflinks, haunted by whispers of a scandal that could erase everything he'd built. His days were an endless carousel of board meetings, charity galas, and secret meetings in darkened offices, each carrying the weight of potential ruin. To those closest to him, Walter seemed invincible, a tycoon immune to fear or failure. But behind closed doors, the walls were closing in. His wife had left him months earlier, tired of the rumors and the emotional distance that filled their sprawling mansion like a cold fog. His adult children barely spoke to him, embarrassed by his ruthless reputation and unwilling to be part of the spectacle his life had become. Tonight was supposed to be his moment to reclaim the spotlight, to silence the whispers, and remind everyone he was still the king of the city. Yet the smile he practiced in the mirror felt brittle, as if it might crack under the weight of what he knew. And while he arranged every detail of his birthday party to project power and wealth, there was one thing he hadn't planned for: a small, stray cat who'd somehow wandered into his gilded fortress. A cat with secrets of its own. Under the grand dessert table, a tabby cat crouched on trembling paws, her fur matted with city grime, eyes darting between the legs of glittering guests. She was small and thin, with a noticeable scar above her left eye, as though she'd survived battles no creature her size should endure. The room's heat made her pant softly, though she remained hidden, watching the humans in their finery, instinct telling her to stay low and unseen. She had slipped in through a back service door left ajar by a distracted kitchen worker, drawn by the smells of roasted meats and sweet pastries. Her whiskers twitched with anxiety as feet in polished Italian shoes passed inches from her face, unaware of the silent intruder in their midst. Occasionally, scraps of laughter and fragments of conversation drifted to her ears, words she couldn't comprehend but felt nonetheless. Tension, fear, secrets. She didn't know what a billionaire was or why this man seemed so important, but she sensed something fragile about him, a vulnerability beneath the sharp suits. The cat, whom no one yet knew, was about to change the destiny of every soul in that glittering room. And while she was just a stray in search of warmth, her arrival was nothing short of fate. All at once, the cat darted forward, driven by hunger and a strange pull toward the center of the crowd, claws clicking softly against the marble floor as she leapt onto the silk-draped table. Gasps and shrieks rippled across the ballroom, forks clattered onto plates, and the violinist's bow scraped a sour note as everyone turned in shock. At first, the cat simply sat among the sugar roses and gold-dusted macarons, eyes wide, tail twitching like a question mark. Guests stumbled backward, some lifting their phones to record the absurd sight, while Walter stared in disbelief, a flicker of something close to fear flashing across his features. In the sudden hush, the cat's raspy meow echoed like an accusation, cutting through the layers of champagne bubbles and false merriment. It was as though the universe had cracked open to let this tiny creature speak truths no human dared utter. People whispered that it was a bad omen, that stray animals in a place like this could only mean trouble. And Walter, who'd built his empire on controlling every detail, felt a chill spread through his veins. Because the cat wasn't just there for food, she'd brought evidence of a secret that could destroy him. Just before anyone could grab her, the cat tilted her head and dropped something from her mouth onto the white linen tablecloth. A small, crumpled slip of paper, stained with something dark and rusty. A collective gasp rose as Walter lunged forward, eyes locked on the scrap, his face pale as marble beneath the ballroom lights. Cameras flashed, recording not a billionaire's triumph, but his sudden unraveling, as he snatched the paper and tried to conceal it with shaking hands. The cat remained beside him, watching intently, her scarred eye glinting like a shard of broken glass. Around them, guests whispered furiously, speculation growing like wildfire, each person desperate to know what could terrify a man like Walter Grayson. Somewhere in the back of the room, a woman in a red dress whispered, "It's evidence. It has to be." Security began closing in, radios crackling, but the damage was done. The cat had delivered her message, and the secret she'd carried was poised to explode into public view. And though Walter tried to hold it all together, his world was already falling apart. Because there are some truths that even all the money in the world can't bury. Walter stood frozen, gripping the scrap of paper so tightly it crinkled in his fist, as though he could crush the secrets it held into oblivion. His chest heaved beneath his tailored tuxedo, the silk bow tie feeling like a noose as eyes bore into him from every angle. The cat sat beside the collapsed macarons, licking her paw with serene indifference, as if she'd merely hopped onto a stranger's table for a snack. Guests whispered his name like a curse, curiosity slicing through the room sharper than any business rival ever had. A few bold ones tried to edge closer, phones raised, hoping for a glimpse of the paper that might reveal the fall of one of America's richest men. Walter's assistant reached for him, panic etched across her face, her lips moving silently as she urged him to leave. But Walter remained rooted to the spot, staring at the cat as if she'd crawled out of his worst nightmare. Outside, sirens wailed in the distance, merging with the muffled strains of a forgotten birthday song still playing on the hotel speakers. The cat tilted her head, eyes locked on Walter's trembling form, as if she alone knew the weight of the truth he was hiding. And in that silence, a single thought echoed in Walter's mind. There was no running from this moment. No one else saw the cat's battered state quite like Walter did, as he stared into her wide green eyes, noticing every rib beneath her fur, each trembling breath that made her tiny frame quiver. Her fur was streaked with oil and city dust, her ears ragged as if bitten by frost or cruel claws, and a thin crust of dried blood marked the edges of her scar. In the bright ballroom lights, her eyes gleamed an unnatural brilliance, reflecting fear and hunger, but also something almost human. A deep, silent accusation. When she meowed again, the sound wavered between a plea and a warning, stirring a wave of uneasy sympathy among the onlookers. A young woman in an emerald gown whispered that someone should call animal control, while a man in a navy suit declared it an absolute scandal for a stray to get inside. The cat, meanwhile, kept staring at Walter, as though she'd chosen him alone from the sea of glittering guests. She seemed both fragile and formidable, like a creature who'd seen horrors and survived. And for the first time all night, Walter felt small beneath her unblinking gaze. Because it wasn't just a cat that had entered his party, it was a living reminder that secrets can claw their way to the surface, no matter how tightly you try to bury them. Walter tried to slip the paper into his pocket, but the cat suddenly lunged and batted at his hand, sharp claws grazing his skin and drawing a thin line of red. A collective gasp rippled through the guests as blood welled along Walter's knuckle, a vivid stain against the snowy tablecloth. His assistant squealed and tried to pull him away, but Walter held his ground, shaking as the cat stared at him, meowing insistently as though demanding he show everyone what was written. The room seemed to close in, ceiling lights burning too bright, shadows stretching like claws across the marble floors. People whispered theories about blackmail, embezzlement, even murder, the cat's sudden violence adding fuel to the hysteria. Security moved closer, radios crackling with coded chatter, but no one dared touch the cat as if she were sacred or cursed. Somewhere in the corner, a reporter from a gossip blog lifted her camera for a closer shot, eager to catch the billionaire bleeding at his own party. And Walter felt something inside him splinter, the realization dawning that his empire rested on lies more fragile than he'd ever admitted, because now the cat had tasted blood, and the truth refused to stay hidden. The stakes felt impossibly high as Walter read the paper again, trying to shield it from the cameras while sweat trickled down his temple. Scrawled across the wrinkled slip were words only he seemed to recognize, details about offshore accounts, hidden transactions, and a payoff connected to a tragic accident years ago that had vanished from public memory. His heart slammed against his ribs so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. Around him, the music had finally stopped, leaving a raw, brittle silence in its wake. The cat, as though sensing the shift, crept closer, brushing her thin body against Walter's leg, leaving streaks of dirt on his pristine trousers. His eyes welled as memories flooded back. The accident, the hush money, the sleepless nights spent praying no one would ever discover the truth. He knew if this paper reached the wrong hands, he'd lose everything. His fortune, his reputation, maybe even his freedom. The guests watched in breathless suspense, some horrified, some ravenous for gossip, as if waiting for a guillotine to fall. And for the first time in decades, Walter understood that money couldn't buy silence forever, because sometimes fate arrives on four paws and demands justice. Walter stared at the cat as she settled beside him, curling her tail around her trembling body, eyes still fixed on his face like twin emerald interrogators. His assistant urged him again to leave, whispering frantically about damage control and calling the lawyers, but Walter barely heard her voice over the roaring in his ears. 100 eyes burned into him, waiting to see if he'd confess, destroy the evidence, or keep pretending. The cat let out a soft, broken mewl that echoed off the crystal chandeliers, slicing straight through Walter's soul. He closed his eyes, gripping the paper so hard his knuckles went white, as the reality of his double life pressed down like a weight he could no longer carry. For years he'd hidden behind contracts and lawyers, silencing anyone who threatened to expose him. But tonight, a stray cat had crossed his path and demanded a different choice. And in that moment, something inside Walter snapped, because he couldn't walk away anymore. He took a shuddering breath, opened his eyes, and turned to face the crowd. And with the cat perched beside him like a tiny, ragged judge, he prepared to reveal the secret that might cost him everything, yet finally set him free. Walter drew a trembling breath and lifted the slip of paper high enough for everyone to see, his voice raw and shaking as he confessed words he'd rehearsed only in his nightmares. The crowd fell into a stunned hush, eyes widening as he spoke of offshore accounts, hush money, and a tragic accident that had killed a young man named Raphael 3 years ago. A death officially ruled an accident, but one Walter now admitted he'd helped cover up to protect his empire. Murmurs rippled like aftershocks through the ballroom as faces shifted from shock to horror, some guests clutching pearls or covering their mouths in disbelief. Walter's voice cracked as he described the guilt that had gnawed at him, the endless nights he couldn't sleep, haunted by Raphael's mother's cries. Tears spilled down his cheeks, streaking the expensive powder on his face, revealing the raw, frightened man beneath the billionaire exterior. The cat remained beside him on the table, sitting tall, her green eyes never leaving Walter, as though holding him accountable for every word. A woman in a silver dress dropped her champagne glass, the shattering sound echoing like a gunshot through the silence. And as the echoes faded, the truth hung heavy in the ballroom air, undeniable and corrosive, because Walter had just thrown open the gates to secrets meant to stay buried. Outside the ballroom, news crews arrived in a frenzy. Camera lights flaring like paparazzi flashes through the glass doors, reporters shouting questions about fraud and murder. Security guards attempted to block entrances, but the cat leapt from the table and slinked between suited legs, her small body somehow slipping past every human barrier. She emerged onto the marble steps of the hotel, blinking beneath the neon glow and the icy summer wind, now infamous as the cat who'd exposed a billionaire's sins. Guests streamed outside, some crying, some filming, some simply standing in stunned silence, while Walter followed slowly behind, undone but strangely lighter. He paused on the steps, watching the cat weave through reporters who gasped and pointed as if she were a celebrity in her own right. Sirens wailed closer, patrol cars screeching to a halt, uniformed officers rushing toward the entrance as hotel staff tried to keep control. The cat stopped in the middle of the flashing lights and turned her gaze back toward Walter, eyes shining as though to say, "It's time." And in that moment, Walter realized he was no longer afraid, because the cat hadn't just destroyed his world, she'd given him the chance to rebuild it, honestly. At the local precinct, Walter sat in an interrogation room beneath buzzing fluorescent lights, exhaustion weighing down his shoulders like chains. He told detectives everything. The hidden accounts, the hush money, the accident, the desperate measures he'd taken to protect his empire at the cost of his soul. A female detective with kind eyes nodded silently, scribbling notes, while another officer stepped out to call the district attorney. Meanwhile, outside the station, crowds gathered, holding signs demanding justice for Raphael, while others carried photos of the stray cat now hailed as a hero across social media. In a nearby animal control van, the cat sat calmly in a carrier, staring out through steel bars with regal composure, as if she understood the magnitude of her own actions. Reporters pressed microphones against the glass, calling her the whistleblower cat, her scarred face now the symbol of truth clawing its way into daylight. Walter, watching through the interrogation room window, felt a strange ache of gratitude toward the creature who'd destroyed his illusions, because somewhere between fear and confession, he'd remembered he was still human, and as he spoke, he found himself breathing easier than he had in years. At the animal hospital later that night, veterinarians carefully examined the cat, while news cameras lingered outside, waiting for updates on the creature who had toppled a billionaire's empire. Her injuries, though not life-threatening, told a silent story of harsh streets, narrow escapes, and a will to survive stronger than any wall of secrets. One vet, a middle-aged man with graying hair and gentle hands, wiped a tear as he whispered, "You saved more than yourself tonight, little one." They cleaned her wounds, stitched the small gash above her eye, and placed her in a warm recovery cage lined with soft blankets. Meanwhile, Walter appeared at the hospital lobby doors, still flanked by plainclothes officers, but allowed to speak briefly to the press. Cameras captured his sunken eyes as he told reporters he would plead guilty, repay stolen funds, and testify about the corruption his confession might expose. The cat's soft mewl echoed from the treatment room, a fragile sound that seemed to bind everyone in the building together with a single thread of hope. And in that moment, even the hardest skeptics believed in second chances. Because sometimes the smallest creature carries the greatest courage. As dawn painted the Chicago skyline in pale pinks and golds, Walter stood outside the animal hospital, looking utterly transformed. His suit was wrinkled, his hair tousled, but his shoulders were no longer bowed under the crushing weight of lies. Beside him, the cat, now cleaned and bandaged, sat in a carrier, blinking up at the man who had finally chosen truth over power. A few nurses gathered near the doors, smiling softly, while a pair of police officers nodded respectfully at Walter, recognizing not just his guilt, but his courage to confess. Social media was ablaze with hashtags praising the cat as a symbol of justice and resilience, strangers donating thousands toward her care and future adoption. Walter placed a trembling hand on the carrier, whispering words no one else could hear, his eyes shining with something close to peace. Around them, the city buzzed awake, unaware it had just witnessed a miracle forged from fur, secrets, and redemption. Because the man who once ruled skyscrapers had been brought to his knees by a cat no bigger than a loaf of bread. And in losing everything, he might have discovered what truly matters. Months later, Walter Grayson lived in a modest two-bedroom apartment overlooking the Chicago River, far from the penthouses and private clubs he once called home. His suits were replaced by sweaters and jeans, and instead of boardrooms, his days were filled with court hearings, community service, and quiet reflection. The cat, now named Justice by the internet, lived with him, padding softly around the hardwood floors as sunlight streamed through gauzy curtains. Every morning, Walter carried her onto the balcony, where she perched on the railing, watching seagulls wheel over the water with curious eyes. Neighbors sometimes recognized him as the billionaire who fell from grace, but most treated him kindly, offering nods of respect rather than judgment. At night, Walter lay awake, listening to Justice's gentle purr, grateful for the small, living reminder of the truth that had set him free. He found solace in simple routines, brewing coffee, folding laundry, cleaning litter boxes, that felt strangely more meaningful than any business deal he'd ever signed. And as the seasons changed, the sharp pain of his past began to soften, leaving room for something new. Because in Justice's green eyes, he saw not just the ruin of his empire, but the possibility of redemption. Justice became a local celebrity, her scarred face appearing on posters around the city, promoting animal adoption and whistleblower protections. Children wrote letters addressed to the hero cat, thanking her for helping tell the truth, their crayon drawings pinned to the wall of the animal hospital where she'd been treated. The veterinarians who'd saved her still visited often, dropping off toys and treats, marveling at how glossy her coat had become under Walter's care. Social media accounts dedicated to Justice chronicled her daily adventures, napping on windowsills, batting at strings, snuggling in Walter's lap during chilly evenings. Meanwhile, Walter began speaking at community centers, sharing his story to warn others about the cost of secrets and the healing power of honesty. Some called him a fraud seeking sympathy, but many others saw a man trying to make amends. In those rooms filled with ex-cons, recovering addicts and struggling families, Walter found his voice again, because he understood now that confession wasn't weakness. It was the first step toward building a life worth living. And every time he spoke, Justice sat beside him on the stage, a living symbol of unlikely courage. Walter and Justice developed small rituals that stitched their new life together. A walk along the river at sunrise, feeding stray cats in the neighborhood park, volunteering at the animal shelter where Justice had become a mascot of hope. The shelter staff welcomed Walter like family, offering him quiet smiles and strong coffee as he scooped litter boxes and carried bags of kibble. Whenever new cats arrived, trembling and thin, Walter remembered the night Justice leapt onto his birthday table and blew apart the fortress he'd built around himself. He whispered gentle words to each frightened animal, telling them that sometimes the smallest creatures carry the biggest secrets and the power to change the world. At the shelter's annual fundraiser, Justice was carried onto the stage in a tiny tuxedo harness, earning a standing ovation from hundreds of guests. Walter spoke afterward, voice trembling as he declared he'd donate the remainder of his liquidated assets to fund the shelter's expansion. For the first time in his life, applause felt genuine rather than transactional. And as he stood in the bright stage lights, he realized he was no longer defined by money, but by the life he was building, one day at a time. Beyond Walter's personal journey, Justice's story ignited broader change. A city council member introduced legislation nicknamed Justice's Law, strengthening whistleblower protections for those exposing corporate crimes. Animal rescue organizations reported surges in adoptions, inspired by the stray cat who'd become a global icon of truth and survival. Talk shows, podcasts, and news outlets replayed the infamous footage of Justice leaping onto the Billionaire's dessert table, a moment now etched into American cultural memory. Walter was invited to testify before Congress about corporate accountability, speaking humbly about how one creature had forced him to confront his deepest sins. Journalists who once hounded him for scandal now asked how he'd found the strength to start over. And while some still called him a criminal who deserved prison, others saw a man trying every day to atone. Even Raphael's mother, once broken by grief, sent Walter a letter saying she forgave him because Justice had shown her that no soul was beyond saving. And across the world, people remembered that sometimes the smallest voice can bring the mightiest walls crashing down. On a cool autumn evening, Walter sat on his modest balcony, Justice curled in his lap, purring as city lights shimmered on the river below. The wind carried distant laughter from passing boats, mingling with the rustle of dry leaves. Walter watched the stars emerging between drifting clouds, feeling the weight of his old life fading into something he could finally leave behind. He stroked Justice's soft fur, whispering thanks to the creature who had saved him from himself. Inside, his phone buzzed with notifications of donations pouring in for animal shelters and whistleblower support funds inspired by their story. He breathed deeply, savoring a peace he'd never known, his heart no longer chained to secrets or fear. Around him, the world moved on, unaware that its course had shifted because of one small cat and one man brave enough to tell the truth. And as Justice lifted her scarred face toward the stars, Walter whispered, "We didn't just save each other, we saved so many more." because he hadn't merely confessed his sins or rescued a cat from the streets. He didn't just save a cat. He found himself